Welcome to Tips for Gamers. Today we're going to talk about how Ohio State gets unfairly treated in the rankings. And I know some people are going to say, man, it's Big Ten bias. You just love Ohio State. And before you say that, I just want you guys to know I don't hate the SEC. I hate the politics of the SEC. I hate the politics of the top 25 AP polls. And I'll show you why. In the preseason polls, Georgia was ranked 1, Michigan, then Ohio State, Alabama, LSU, USC, Penn State, Florida State, Clemson, and Washington. In week 2, Ohio State loses 2 spots in the ranking. Alabama jumps up. Florida State jumps up. Georgia remains. Michigan remains. USC does not lose a ranking whatsoever. Penn State remains as well. And then Washington, Tennessee, and Notre Dame all receive a increase in their ranking. And a lot of people said, well, it's because they struggled against Indiana. Well, that's interesting. That's an interesting philosophy there, because Georgia did okay against UT Martin in the first half of the game, 17-0. And some of these points were scored literally right before half. And so it was interesting because they just didn't look super polished, and it was okay. It was like, all right, well, we'll let Georgia marinate a little bit. Michigan. What did Michigan do? Well, Michigan beat East Carolina at home 30-3. Now, East Carolina is a Group 5 team. They're not, the worst ever, but they're clearly not a Power 5 team. They don't send a lot of guys into the NFL, and it's a little bit interesting. So Alabama plays Mid-Tennessee State, and you could see they were waiting to bump up Alabama. Florida State has a great game against LSU. This was fantastic. And Ohio State apparently struggled against Indiana. Well, Michigan beat up East Carolina 30-3 at home. Ohio State had to play at Indiana and beat them 23-3, which was only 7 points less than what Michigan did. And Michigan has more returning players. Ohio State was trying 2 different quarterbacks because their quarterback went the 2nd overall pick in the draft. Their wide receiver, they lost a wide receiver as well to the draft, top 15 pick. They lost 3 offensive linemen in the draft. They lost several defensive players. So they were just testing out their team. And Indiana held on to the ball, just even down double digits. They just ran the ball and ran the time down. They just were trying to not get scored on a lot. That's basically, they knew they were going to lose is what it seemed like, but let's just not lose by a lot. So they just ran the ball, and it was really confusing. But that's what they did. So if you're looking at this, why would Michigan not get penalized, but Ohio State gets penalized, all because it's 23-3, and it was only 7 points off, and they were the ones, Ohio State played away, Michigan didn't. A little bit confusing to me there. Florida State does great. That was an excellent game. I still wouldn't have put Florida State above Ohio State. I thought it was premature. And some people disagreed with us on that. Week 3, Georgia has a pretty solid game against a no-name school. And Georgia's away games this year against Auburn, Vanderbilt, Tennessee, and Georgia Tech. So I know that's a nail-biter there. Not the best away games, I'd say. I'd say they were pretty... not really fantastic. So Michigan plays at home again against UNLV. They beat them 35-7. Okay, remember, they have a returning team. So these numbers should be big for Michigan. I'm not saying Michigan should drop. I'm just saying, they should be big, and the numbers weren't too bad. So Florida State jumps up, and Texas jumps up because Texas beat number 3 ranked Alabama. Because Alabama's really good, and if Texas beats Alabama at home, that's world, crazy news right there. Okay, and Texas did very well against Alabama. USC also jumps up, and USC didn't get penalized at all for beating San Jose State 56-28 for the first week. It was 21-14 going into half against San Jose State, which I found to be a little bit interesting. So they jump in the ranking by 1, and Ohio State drops down again. Well, surely it's because they did terrible. Well, it was interesting to see that they scored the same amount of points as Michigan did against UNLV, basically the same type of opponents. Group 5, not very good, and they scored the same amount of points, and this entire time they're still trying to figure out their team because they lost so much, and they're putting up roughly the same amount of points as Michigan is against, and I would say Indiana's a better opponent than East Carolina, Youngstown State's about the same as UNLV. They're just not really that good, and they're putting up about the same amount of points, and Ohio State's getting penalized for trying their team out. Texas obviously jumped up. USC jumped up. So week 4, that's where we're at now, and this one's really interesting. Georgia remains the same, doesn't drop in the rankings at all, and they played South Carolina at home, and it was 24-14. And Joel Klatt talked about this as well. We're going to reiterate it, but give you a little bit more on it as well, because this is insane to us. But UGA had 3 points, and South Carolina had 14 points in the first half. South Carolina was dominating them. They don't drop in the rankings because they scored 21 in the second half, which is really interesting, because I feel like if that was Ohio State and South Carolina came to Ohio State and they only beat them 24-14, people would automatically go, they're terrible. You got to crush them. But when Georgia does it, the common theme will be, well, it's an SEC school. That's what it is. It's an SEC school, and that's how the SEC works. So it's interesting because I think that they're unfairly graded. What about Michigan? Well, Michigan threw 3 interceptions, J.J. McCarthy, against Bowling Green. It was 14-6 in the first half against Bowling Green. They don't lose a ranking. If that was Ohio State, what would that look like? Probably not good, right? Texas jumps up in the ranking, and this is really interesting. This is where things start to get really, really interesting. They jump up in the ranking because they beat Wyoming. Well, Wyoming, the game was 10-10 until fourth quarter. Quinn Ewers threw for 131 yards with 2 TDs. 10-10. If Ohio State brought Wyoming to their stadium and it was 10-10 by fourth quarter, do you think that they're going to jump them in the rankings? I don't think so. I think that they would literally just demolish them in the rankings. And it's interesting because Texas is keeping on to them beating Alabama, right? It's very interesting. Alabama had a very, very solid game, I would say, against USF, right? Alabama had a fantastic game against USF. The game was 17-3 at the end, and it was 3-3 until 5 minutes left in the third quarter. Is the first time Alabama scored a touchdown on USF. Okay, and they played at USF. So Alabama just didn't really look good. So this is where it gets really, really interesting. Ohio State scores 63 points, and they allow 10 points. They have the third-ranked defense, by the way. Georgia's played less talent, pretty much. They've played, I guess you could say, close to, but I'd still say less, because Indiana and Western Kentucky are still better than just playing South Carolina, in my opinion. And, you know, people will say, well, that's Western Kentucky, right? Western Kentucky is just... they're just simply not that good, Western Kentucky. Well, Western Kentucky played USF and beat them 41-24 earlier in this season. 41-24, the same team that took it to Alabama and didn't allow a touchdown until 5 minutes and something seconds in the third quarter. Explain to me, if you're an Ohio State fan, how would you feel about this? Do you think that this looks fair to you? Do you think that this is an accurate ranking? Do you think that there's no politics involved in this whatsoever? Because I could tell you right now, from Ohio State perspective, they're looking at this and saying, well, what do we got to do? Why are we treated differently than everyone else? Because if we posted those scores, we'd get crushed. Texas can keep it close against Wyoming. And they'll still get an increase in the ranking just because they beat a team that struggled against a team that Ohio State beat the team that crushed the team that they struggled against. It's kind of confusing. I understand that if you may be confused here because it starts to confuse me. I'm very confused at these rankings. I don't believe these rankings. I don't think that they're just and fair, and I don't think they have anything to them, any merit to them, any base beside bias and political. That's all I see. Let us know what you guys think. Do you think we're wrong?